Hi, my name is Dan Doriani. I'm professor of biblical theology at Covenant Theological Seminary and the founder and president of the Center for Faith and Work. And you're listening to RYM's podcast, The Local Youth Worker.
One, two, three. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode. As you heard from the tagline, I'm here with Dr. Dan Doriani. Dan, how's it going?
It's good. It's a beautiful day in St. Louis, and the sun is shining, and the temperature's 68 degrees, and it's a delight to speak to you.
Very, very nice. And I should say welcome back. I had to go and look. You were on episodes 364 through 366 as we were talking about a rest and work balance. And so it's good to have you back on again. At the time of this recording, it's been just a few weeks, but I was able to go to a micro event that Covenant Seminary hosted, where your topic was narcissism is toxic for pastors, but so is lack of confidence. And I'm looking forward to digging more into that and talking about that. That was an excellent lecture for sure. But before we do that, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your podcast. You're speaking a lot. You're a pastor. You write a lot, but you also have your own podcast. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I do. It's called Working with Dan Doriani, and it seems kind of self-promoting, but I'm the only Dan Doriani in the world, so you might as well make use of it. So
Sure.
So basically what I do is interview people, about 20 people a year, on the question, how am I practicing my faith in my work? And we get politicians and scientists and business leaders and artists and authors from all walks of life. We had an AI guy a while ago, aeronautical
Nice.
engineers, historians, you name it. They're all trying to live out their cartoonists. They're trying to live out their faith in easy settings and not so easy settings. So that's what the podcast is about. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was looking back recently. I mean, you had Sandra McCracken on there, Kylan Hansen, Tim Challies as well. There was something you said, and I don't know if we can edit this out if you'd rather not talk about it, but you said something, kind of a passing comment of you getting punched in the heart.
Yeah.
and I was just curious. I mean, can you share that story? I was wondering what happened there.
Yeah, just about a year ago, I got punched in the heart by accident, of course. I was playing tennis, and my partner was, I'm not young. I mean, everybody in the group was formerly a very good tennis player, and now we're old, formerly good tennis players. And a guy had a new hip, and he hadn't played for a long time, and he was just full of excitement and just running around the court like he'd forgotten how you're supposed to play doubles. And there was a ball that was clearly my ball, and he went to get it because he was very fast, and now he's fast for his age group. And he looked up and realized that I was hitting the ball and just stuck his hands out to avoid a full-blown collision. We're both around 180, so it wasn't we're old, so we're not going real fast, but we would have really collided. And he just stuck his hand out and knuckled me in the heart. And my pulse went to 200 and stayed there for about 2.5 days, and then came down. So I mean, people do die from it once in a while. So the Lord chose to give me more years. It's in karate, they do it on purpose. If you can get the person in this spot between their ribs, just as their heart is beating, the match is over. And wow. People do die once, 20 people die a year, kind of like the number of shark attacks die per year from that accident that does occur from time to time.
Wow. Yeah, you just kind of said that in passing, and I was thinking, okay, what happened there? I was just curious. So yeah, everybody go check out Dan's podcast, and he talks about that with Tim Challies and just other great content out there. And it's interesting, just as you said, just a spectrum of people in their work and how they work. It's fascinating. Well, like I said at the outset, you gave a talk recently at the Gospel Coalition National Conference, and I assume that's going to be posted eventually. I don't know if it's out there now.
Yeah, they post everything. And for what it's worth, there's a much more academic, less practical version of it in the Westminster Journal from spring of this year. So I mean, I heavily adapted it. That group was probably 80% pastors, and a journal articles for anybody and everybody. So
Sure.
they're different, but you can get it online event soon, maybe already, and you can get it in the Westminster Journal.
Okay, well, I'll look for that, and for our listeners, I'll put that in the show notes. But I'd love for you, and again, the title is "Narcissism is Toxic for Pastors, but So is Lack of Confidence." I'd love for you just to talk about the origins of this topic. I mean, you were sharing a little bit this journal article, but how did this come about? What was going on that just made you want to talk about this, write about this, think about this?
Thanks. Great question, John. There are probably three different things. One is a lot of pastors have failed. Some of them are very public, and we don't have to recount the names, but have failed because of bullying or narcissistic behavior. Self-promoting, I'm the center of the universe. Of course, we're familiar with pastors misusing funds or sexual issues, but in recent years, abuse of power has been number one, and people connect that to narcissism, which can sometimes be the case, to be sure. So narcissism is definitely toxic. Nobody wants to be connected to a narcissistic person. If you try to correct them, they become enraged. How dare you? They push you out. They surround themselves with admirers and become impervious to critique or to correction, and slowly go down the path that's not helpful when no one can correct you. So narcissism is toxic. That's point one. Pastors do fail. There are narcissistic pastors. I think it's been overblown significantly. I think that there are bullies, and it's terrible, and there are narcissists who are pastors, and it's terrible. But I don't think there are as many as people say. And, there is a book, I don't want to, speak too explicitly, but there's a book that talks about narcissism coming to church. And it does say in one place that most pastors are on the narcissism spectrum. And I have an extremely difficult time believing that, in part because the vast majority of the pastors I know are not narcissistic. They're humble, quick to repent, and servants, and far more, this is what partly drove me, are actually recipients of bullying than are bullies. And you got elders and deacons and people in their church who don't realize that pastor serves everybody, but that doesn't mean everybody's the pastor's boss. And if the pastor does something that's contrary to their preferences, a lot of people feel free to unload on their pastors. And so there's a crisis of confidence. And in that group, I mean, you were there. In that group, there were a lot of men who were beaten up. If you heard the Q&A session, every question in one form or another was, how do I endure events that have caused me to lose my confidence, including, and then conversations afterward, privately, as you can imagine, had very much the same character and much more overt. So I also think and the literature suggests this, that pastors need confidence. And as the narcissism book says, pages later, there is such a thing as, sounds like an oxymoron, healthy narcissism, which is confidence, conviction, belief that you have gifts, you have something to say, something to contribute, that your perception of what's needed is weighty, you have some expertise. And that's needed in a lot of fields: politicians, lawyers, professional athletes, professional entertainers, professors, pastors, lawyers, detectives, surgeons, CEOs. There's about 10 to 12 fields that everybody says you need some confidence. And pastors, I think, too often have been robbed of that. And they're accused of being narcissistic bullies, partly because the terms are in the air and it's not necessarily true, and it's damaging to the church and to pastors to accuse them of narcissism or bullying all the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much you said there, and I want to dig into that. I know we're needing to take a little break, and so maybe on the other side of the break, it might be helpful for us to define narcissism as well. Again, that's the word that can just be thrown around a lot, and I feel like it's a word that's being used a lot lately. And so let's take a quick break, and then on the other side of the break, let's define that a bit. All right, everyone, I'm back here with Dan Doriani talking about narcissism being toxic for pastors, but also a lack of confidence. And we're kind of ending and talking about trying to maybe define narcissism, but maybe easier just to describe narcissism a little bit more. It's kind of one of those things I feel like we all know what it is in some ways, but maybe to help clarify just some of those descriptions and ways in which you would describe narcissism.
Yeah, I would say, the standard definition of a narcissist is someone who has a very high opinion of themselves, whether their physical appearance, which was the starting point, or their intellectual or physical skills, or even emotional skills. And then they have a lot of self-reference. Everybody has self-reference, but they have an excessive amount of self-reference. They're selfish. They feel entitled. They lack empathy. They want to gather admirers around themselves. And the focal point of the various books and articles that are written about narcissists is it's most damaging when you have somebody who's talented, maybe a really good speaker, and they rally, or leader, organizer, and they rally people around themselves excessively. So, I mean, a leader needs to say, come on, let's go. But a leader also needs to say, hey, but I could be wrong. Please tell me what you think. I don't have all expertise. I don't have all knowledge. There has to be humility and confidence, both. You have to know things and have skills, and know you don't have all skills, and know that we're all very finite. We're all sinners. And so we all need correction. And that's what's, as it's classically understood, that's what's missing in a narcissist.
Yeah. And as I was just thinking about your title, it kind of seems like we've got narcissism on one end of the spectrum and then lack of confidence on the other end of the spectrum. But I'm also curious, are the two related in some way? Because it seemed like the two of them do have a self-focus in some ways. Just curious your thoughts on that, because they're definitely the opposite end of the spectrum, but just also wondering if there's a overlap there too.
Well, certainly if you lose your confidence, you can go in a downward spiral by focusing on yourself and your deficits. So if that's your point, I certainly agree with it. I do think that, I'm just going to say, in my experience, a lot of pastors start off with confidence and have it beaten out of them. And it's beaten out of them by controversies in the church about COVID and masks and politics over the last several years. But then also, I'll call it the drumbeat of criticism in some church. That sermon wasn't good enough. There weren't any interesting illustrations. I mean, he's sound, but he's boring. Does he work as hard as he should? I was in the hospital. He didn't come see me. Why did he hire so-and-so? Why didn't he fire so-and-so? So there's a lot of that. Maybe it's my unique experience, but I seem to see it a great deal. And again, when you get depressed, you do focus on yourself possibly too much, but I don't see it fundamentally as a problem of excessive introspection.
Yeah. And I know something too that you talked about in the lecture is just skill and character, and in this whole discussion. And so maybe unpack that a little bit for us as well. Right.
So, when we look at the qualifications for a leader in the Bible, we have the list we know the best is 1 Timothy chapter 3, and it has 2 skills: apt to teach and able to manage his household, and therefore able to manage the church. And it has 11 character traits: not quick to quarrel, self-controlled, hospitable, etc. What's really interesting is that it's set up with he who desires to be an overseer desires a noble task, and so we're ready for tasks. And then we get a bunch of character traits, which means your first task is to be the man, be a leader, be godly. Now, the second list over in 1 Timothy 4 actually is almost exactly 50-50. So, love and humility, but also, teaching and courageous, and expounding the word. It says reading the word, but it means, in context, it means explaining the word, reading it with explanations. So in 1 Timothy 4, it's 50-50. In the book of Acts, it's kind of 50-50, about half character, half skill. So we don't want to focus exclusively on skill. we want to slightly focus on character more, but you have to recognize there is such a thing as gifting. The church has been gifted all sorts of people with capacities, and we need to use them. And some people are capable of preaching to a large group, and they're capable of leading, and they should do so joyfully, cheerfully, faithfully, and the church should receive that with thanksgiving for God's gifts.
Yeah, that's good. And I wanted to go back, and I mean, we'll get into skill in just a little bit, but you were sharing, just kind of pulling back the curtain on just some of the criticisms that pastors receive, and like you said, having kind of the confidence beat out of them in a lot of ways over critiques over sermons and all sorts of things. You're a professor. You've also been a pastor for how many years? I mean, you've been.
Depends how you count. I've been a full-time pastor for about 15. I've been an interim many times. Always part-time, sort of on the side. But
Sure.
anyway, I've got some years in, yes.
So I'd love for you, just from your own personal experience, but as well as friends serving in the ministry, just what would you say is the hardest part of pastoral work as you just kind of think over your years and conversations with others? What are some of those most challenging aspects of pastoral work?
It depends so much, John, on the person. Mm-hmm. So for one person who's maybe a caregiver, a shepherd, a leader of small groups, and they're best at that, then preaching is the hardest. Preparing sermons, delivering sermons is the hardest. For somebody who's a preacher and a teacher, then maybe organization or possibly the caregiving side. So I would say, I'll just say personally, there are two things that are hard for me. One is the counseling of really hard problems. Marriage is falling apart. It weighs on most pastors so heavily. They're just so stricken when they see a marriage breaking up or a man or a woman sinning and callously refusing to repent. It just crushes your spirit. And going down the path of ruin, or so it seems. That's one. For me, also in some ways, the hardest thing was to switch, to go from preparing sermons to staff meeting to counseling. I just found that very, very hard. And many pastors have to do that every week. You almost wish you had a 30-minute buffer, but you don't. So frequently you don't.
Yeah, well, curious, just thinking of a healthy confidence for a pastor. What does that look like? What does a biblical confidence? I mean, we're talking about skills a minute ago, and gifting and sense of a call. Right. What does that look like?
Yeah. So first of all, it begins with a personal sense that you have a gift, and then the affirmation of that gift by meaningful people who are wise, who know you, know the world, have real contact with God's mission for the church. So if you look at one of the gift lists, like in Romans chapter 12, verses 6-8, it says, we have gifts differing according to the grace given to us, and we should use them if service in our serving. So some people are gifted to serve, and they should serve. They should do that. One who's got the gift of teaching should teach. The one who exhorts, which could mean preaching. I'm not going to go into the reasons for that, but exhorting did mean preaching a lot of times in those days. The one who exhorts in his exhortation, so do it. But then if you're good at giving, you give generously, which means with a glad heart. And if you're a leader, you lead with zeal, with passion, right? And so there should be both joy and willingness, both. I've got a gift, God gave it to me, I should use it. Ideally, you also have joy in that. And it comes by not narcissistic self-reflection, but by some self-reflection, and then wise input, good input. And then, of course, you have mentors who keep you from making mistakes. You say, hey, I'm going to do this. And the mentor says, that's a great idea, Dan, John, but probably not now. You probably better wait on that one. Or have you considered how much labor, how much upheaval that would cost? You know what, I haven't. So you need mentors to both affirm and also to rein you in. And it doesn't always mean sin. It could be foolishness, errors, blind spots. But that knowing you have mentors who care about you enables you to be confident, because you say, I think I want to do this. And then people say, hey, thanks, that's a great idea, but not right now. If that's a voice of love, then it gives you confidence you're not going to go into a very difficult spot, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We need those trusted allies that can speak into certain things and speak a hard word and challenge us and be able to receive that. Just curious advice here of how can a pastor teach the congregation that what they're displaying is proper confidence and not narcissism? How can we educate the church on, hey, we are called by God and we need to have a certain amount of confidence in our giftings, and this is not arrogance. This is just boasting in the gifts that He's given. How do we help our congregation know that and see that?
So my short answer, wonderful question, good topic, is by labeling it in other people from the pulpit. And in small groups. So if you're in a discipleship group, you say, isn't it marvelous how John organizes our group? Thanks, John. You've got that gift. And then on Sunday morning during announcements, you don't just say, hey, there's a barbecue on Saturday morning, Saturday lunch for the men who are going to go do a service project. You say, isn't it fantastic how George and Brandon have worked together, each using their gifts. Brandon's a cook. George loves deeds of mercy. And just say that for 60 seconds and you pray for it, and people hear, everybody has gifts and we should recognize them, give thanks for them. That's the way I prefer it. Obviously, at times, you might have to tell your elders, look, I'm weak at this, but I'm strong at that. So if you all can help me with my weakness so I can focus on my strength, that also is helpful. Not just your elders, but anybody you're working with.
Absolutely. That's a great word. And maybe talk a bit more about that as pastors being able to share their weaknesses, pastors being able to still be confident. And we know that as believers, we can boast in our weaknesses, but maybe just talk a little bit about that aspect of this conversation.
Right. So one of the things I've enjoyed and had an enormous privilege is being in groups with really high caliber leaders from with some regularity. And what I notice is that the most brilliant people I know have huge gaps in their knowledge. And I notice that the wisest, let's say I'm in the Gospel Coalition board. So everybody except me belongs there. And I listen to all these very, very intelligent people. And somebody like Phil Ryken, just to name a name, who's the president of Wheaton, who's an organizational genius. And Sandy Wilson, who's now the head of Gospel Coalition, organizational genius. They don't know everything. We have a conversation. Everybody doesn't say, oh, that's it, we're done. We heard from, Sandy and Phil. We all have input. It's stronger even when the weaker members of the team, less gifted in that area, I don't mean we're weak, but less gifted in the area, contribute. So that's always true. Nobody has every skill. Nobody has every skill in full measure. We're finite beings. So that's probably the thing I would like us all to remember first. We're weak, we're finite, we need each other, even when we're so strong in an area.
That's a good word. And I don't really know I don't know how to formulate this question. So maybe but kind of going back to the very beginning where you were saying there's a critique placed on pastors that they all have narcissistic tendencies. There's part of me just through this discussion realizing, ministry's hard, as we're saying, and we're going to get beat up if we're doing any kind of leadership at all, but leadership in the church for sure. So it just seems like the church is set up to keep pastors from being narcissists. So maybe just where is a church failing if there is some kind of narcissistic leadership in place? Because it does seem like, accountability is just going to be a part of a church. And if you have people that are able to speak in, to a leader's life that's going to keep them humble. So again, I don't know where the question is in all of that, but maybe just react to some of that if it
I'll
makes
react
sense.
to your theme. Let me just say, I agree that everybody has some narcissistic capacities within them. You look at a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, they want to be the center of the world, and they scream when they don't get their way sometimes, no matter how delightful they are. And, we still scream when we don't get our way. We don't scream the way a 2-year-old does. So we all have the capacity. And the book's about narcissism and the way that narcissism strikes the church says that, and they're correct. But accountability, let's just say a word about that. Accountability is built into, we're Presbyterian, so it's built into a Presbyterian system. It's built into connectional and hierarchical churches. So Catholic Church, Lutheran Church, Methodist Church, Anglican Church, Presbyterian churches have built-in accountability. I don't say this to generically condemn independent churches, but they do not have built-in accountability. They have free associations. So, you're speaking like a Presbyterian when you say, and that's a compliment, that accountability is built in. Of course, independent churches have some leadership group as well, but if they're selected by the pastor, you can't go outside the church to get help. The second thing is authority accrues, and as you get older and more experienced, people are more and more reticent to challenge you. So in my talk, I discussed the time I mentioned the time I lost my cool after a blind referee fouled me out of a basketball game after I had committed no fouls and I was whistled for 5 fouls. And he was a horrible referee and everybody knew it. And I blew up, and I was a pastor at the time, but I was 28, maybe barely 29. And a deacon who was on the team came over, and later an elder. They just said, "Dan, you can't do that. You're our pastor. You can't do that." And I shouted. I was so angry. I shouted, "When I'm on a basketball court, I am not a pastor. I'm a basketball player." And and the deacon said, "You are a basketball player, but you are always our pastor." He was correct. I was wrong. He was right. And the elder also gently corrected me. If I had that was a small church. I was just, out of grad school. If I were the pastor of a church of 1,000, let's say I was 38 years old, people are a lot more reticent to tell me you're wrong. Stop it. They would have probably said something like, "Oh, he's so passionate at the age of 38. It's amazing. He went overboard a little bit, but our pastor's so awesome. How dare that referee call fouls? Doesn't he know who he's calling fouls on?" And that's my personal illustration. I think everybody knows there's some version of that that's true. It's harder to critique someone who is successful unless they make it very clear that they're always open to critique and correction.
So just thinking about those who listen to this, youth workers, parents tune into this podcast. Let's say there's someone listening to this who thinks their pastor, someone in leadership in their church, is a narcissist. How would you encourage them to go about rebuking that person? Whether it's a youth worker hearing this, thinking the pastor they're working with, or it's a congregant listening to this, what are some thoughts there of just moving towards rebuking?
So everything depends on who you're rebuking and who you are, right? If it's kind of a peer relationship, you say, "Hey, we need to talk about something." If they're really a narcissist, it's hard. You better think long and hard and pray long and hard. If they have a slight twinge of selfishness or defensiveness, it's a lot easier. If they're open and humble, it's vastly easier. The book Bully Pulpit by Michael Kruger, who's I call him, as much if we're friends as much as you can possibly be, given we see each other every other year. So it's a very good book. I don't, of course, agree with every last point, but he tells you what to do for really a chapter about how to handle it. The short comment would be you'd have something concrete. You don't say, "You're a narcissist." You say, "This happened the other day. I was there. You were there. There were witnesses. You blew up at the referee, and there were 80 people who saw it." and this is what you said, and we all heard the same thing. If there aren't witnesses, it's harder. If it's just the two of you, you could say, I hope you remember what happened the other day. And, it's similar to something that happened a month ago. Again, you got to pray they're repentant, and some people are and some aren't. But you go with facts. You say things like, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what we saw. If it's just the two people, you say, this is what I think I saw. And you let them speak. You make it clear you're there in a spirit of love, not to tear them down or to be the police detective and the lawyer and the judge and the jury. You're starting a conversation gently, mindful of your own sins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and earlier you were saying, we all have some elements of narcissism in us, that we're all, broken people. We're inclined, we're turned in on ourselves.
Right.
Maybe just some thoughts on practices to employ to guard us from becoming narcissists. And, I'm thinking again, youth workers listening to this, oftentimes youth workers are on their own. In many ways, they don't have a lot of oversight. And so some of the ways in which youth ministries are set up, we could say that it could foster narcissism and that kind of, just fruit. And so just some thoughts there of anyone listening to this who's thinking, okay, I don't want to head down this path. How might they guard from that?
Yeah, that's another wonderful question and topic. So if you think there's a possibility you could indulge this aspect that's probably present in every person who's ever lived, the first thing you want to do, if you don't have clear oversight, is spend time in the Psalms that include repentance. Read the Bible, compare what you see in the Bible to what you see in your own life. Paul's epistles, Jesus' teaching. If you meditate on the word and pray it over carefully, you will probably find many opportunities to humble yourself. The Bible certainly calls for proper, not humiliation, but humility on many occasions. So spend time with the word. The other thing I would do is cultivate friends. If you don't have a formal overseer, or you do, but they're not doing their job at helping you locate your errors, follies, and sins, then find peers. And I know one of the great things about youth networks is that they tend to create a series of peer relationships. Mm-hmm. And you can ask people. If you're married, you ask your spouse. If you don't ask your spouse, they might tell you anyway. If you're single, your best friends may tell you. You should have a relationship that allows them to do that. So it's scripture, prayer, ideally an overseer. If not an overseer, then the right peers to tell you when you're off.
Yeah, and that's good advice. Thinking of kind of the other end of the spectrum, the one who's listening to this right now and is very beat up and just lacking confidence. What's some encouragement if they, walked into your office and they're just feeling beat up from ministry? How might you point them, to their gifts and to see?
Yeah, I would probably say, look, trust the church. If you've been called to ministry, whether ordained or not ordained, you've been called to ministry. You've been interviewed. You've been trained to some degree, whether it's formal or informal, whether you got a degree or just you're working on courses. You've been trained. You went to get the pastoral training because people wanted you to. They said, hey, Marianne, we want you to go to this training. Why? Because you have the ability here to receive the training and grow from it. So you've been trained, you've been called, you've been approved. A bunch of people told you this is a good idea. So let's remember that. And then let's remember some times when your ministry was fruitful. Let's talk about people of the Lord, about maybe the youth group isn't growing by big numbers, but maybe there's depth. Maybe there's a couple conversions. Maybe there's been real progress. Just remember that and take it to heart. Write it down. Give thanks for it. Celebrate it.
Yeah, I think that's Yeah, it's such a good word. I think so often we can just, I mean, one, we can focus on the negative so much more than the positive, but taking moments to truly celebrate the Lord's work and to stop, to sit back, to see ways in which he can use us. I think that's something we need to practice more as believers. That's counsel we need to hear more. I know we're needing to wrap this up. Other thoughts? There's so much to talk about here. There's so much to unpack. Just anything you feel like we've glossed over, anything you feel like is just an important point to drive home. Any other thoughts before we wrap this up?
Yeah, maybe two quick thoughts. One is that God does say he gives gifts to his church and he gives people, and then he tells us how to develop them. You know, we're told to practice. If you have the gift of teaching, then teach. So you're going to gain skill by teaching. And you know, Paul tells Timothy not to be timid. There's a place for boldness and confidence. The word boldness, which is connected to confidence, appears a number of times in the book of Acts in a positive sense. So there's a place for boldness and confidence. The second thing is we do need to listen to reports. And I hope nobody hears me saying anything other than there is such a thing as bullying and narcissism. It's a real problem. It's not created by the media. It's not just a trend of the day. There is a problem. But let's not simply follow the media and the latest wave of what's happening now. So there is a problem, but narcissism and bullying are not the only problems. Lack of confidence, mistreatment of pastors is a very big one as well. Let's have room in our minds to have several ideas held possibly in tension at once. They're both true. I mean, the most basic thing, however, last point, is that, you know, the Bible says the Lord appoints ambassadors, gospel ambassadors. And if you wonder if there's place for confidence, and it seems like God has chosen you to do this, you have some ability to proclaim the gospel message and all of its ramifications, then you are an ambassador. And if you wonder, oh, how dare I stand up and tell people? Well, it's not your message. You're an ambassador. You have been given a word by the king that the king knows people need. And he has appointed you for that. So go and do it.
Yeah, that's a good word to end on. Dan, I know you've got a lot going on, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on here today.
John, always a pleasure to visit with you. I'm so thankful for your ministry. You're a great encourager. I'm sure you are a tremendous blessing to the people you work with, and I'm thankful for you and your work.
Oh, come and buy without money. Oh, come and feast without pay. For the King has opened his banquet hall to the beggar, the outcast,